Hello, this is Michael Novinson with ISMG. We're going to be discussing narrative attacks today with Wasim Khaled. He is CEO at Blackbird.AI. Wasim, good morning. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you so much for joining us in our Black Hat studio. So I wanted to get a sense from you off the top of what, in your opinion, makes narrative attacks as significant as cyber attacks.
Yeah. So narrative attacks are kind of a new concept. In fact, we have coined this term only about 2 years ago. And what we do at Blackbird is we assess contested information environments, and we help people understand the threat actors, harmful narratives, everything from bot networks to generative AI and agentic swarms, and how it can actually shift public perception. And since the early days, we have actually thought of narrative attacks as an attack on human perception to drive some sort of outcome. And I think people used to think that, social media is just kind of like a mess of opinions, and there's tradecraft within that environment today. So cyber attacks have techniques, tactics, and procedures, and narrative attacks have the same kind of mechanisms to drive a concerted form of harm towards national security organizations, towards Fortune 500s and Global 2000s. And so we assess the information environment to understand an information operation that runs alongside things like cyber attacks that are more traditional. And so it's the threat intelligence analysts that would use our platform to better understand those types of threats.
So when I hear you talking about social media and kind of this information, I mean, I think of things like external attack surface management companies like ZeroFox, who've obviously been in the space for a dozen or more years. What makes what you do at Blackbird different than what we saw perhaps from ZeroFox or from kind of that previous generation EISM companies?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of what those companies focused on were things like fake accounts, meaning like register an account for some sort of fraudulent activity or like a scam of some sort. But like a fake account and a directed narrative attack that's being done at scale, especially using bot networks and AI, function very differently, and they take a completely different set of signals to actually be able to mitigate against. I think even aside from that, when people hear, particularly like CISOs and cybersecurity companies, when they hear social media, they think it's like the domain of like comms teams. And I don't blame them, because that's what it used to be. Like, 15, 20 years back, you had media monitoring tools looking at those platforms, for mentions of a company or person's name, for things like sentiment, so positive, negative. All of that is completely useless in the face of a narrative attack. A narrative attack can fabricate sentiment and share a voice and trending topics. So a company can think there's like 1 million people talking about them in a very positive or negative light, but it's essentially tradecraft that's designed to make you go in the direction they want to go. They want you to be able to engage where they can actually control that narrative. And that could be for financial harm. It could be like for say stock movement. It could be to shift perception of people inside your organization. So from an insider threat perspective. And the fact is that those signals are just not present in the kind of the methods some of the companies in the past have used. And media monitoring is completely a lower threshold signal. So Blackbird provides like an observability layer into the techniques, tactics, and procedures of what the narrative attack actually is made up of. And the most important thing to remember really is that the actors are usually like swivel chair. So like we look at things like, Russian state proxies or Iranian state proxies or state actors as well when they're manipulating a narrative. Say, the boycotts against data centers, for example, where state actors are getting communities riled up because they're trying to reduce our AI capability in this kind of sovereign AI battle. People are not thinking about those kinds of things when they think about narratives. They think about things like reputation. And while that's important, I think the most important thing is, how do you understand which narrative is being designed to harm you or your organization? How do you then turn that into a playbook and a mitigation practice that can be automated? And how can you actually use AI systems and agentic systems to kind of fight fire with fire based on what the adversary is doing?
So in terms of these narrative attacks, typically, do you see them accompanying cyber attacks, or do you see them operating on a standalone basis? And from an adversary standpoint, if they're doing a cyber attack and a narrative attack together, what's the benefit of that versus just a more conventional standalone cyber attack?
I mean, certainly narrative attacks can happen all on their own, and that's actually more common, right? What we have seen though with clients is an information operation running alongside a major cyber attack or breach. I think one example, well, a class of attack would be this kind of geopolitical conflict turning into geoeconomic warfare. And so you have to think about this problem also. It's cognitive warfare. It's kind of gray zone conflict from a military perspective. And so, country A takes out a hospital in country B. Drone strike, let's say. They don't want to engage kinetic. So perhaps they take out a major medical supply chain company and cripple that, right? Here in the US. It's like this asymmetric warfare. The information operation running alongside that is designed to create ongoing persistent damage after the initial incident, right? So that could then continue to impact their stock price. It could confuse all the regulators, partners, investors, shareholders of that company that's been attacked now, create confusion, and further damage and harm that organization. So that's, from an incident monitoring and post-incident response perspective, being able to understand the narrative attack while you're going through that situation or crisis enables you to prioritize what you actually need to really assess and be able to lean into, so everybody actually knows what the whole story is. And so we do see CISOs using our narrative attack alerts in their SOC. And, they have told us that we have prevented cyber attacks, prevented attacks on physical infrastructure, and in other cases, prevented other kinds of actual personal harm to executives. And so this has all happened probably in the last 8 to 10 months, because, the cybersecurity threat intel is actually our most recent and growing category.
Yeah. That's interesting. So in terms of these narrative attacks, to what extent are they being either created or amplified by either generative AI or agentic AI? And to what extent can those advances in AI be used on the defensive side to help thwart narrative attacks?
So, like anything agentic, it amplifies a lot of the techniques that were already being used. So, I have seen or been in environments where it used to be just like a warehouse full of people creating comments on and creating these artificial conflicts, right? It's going back even just 5 or 6 years. That was kind of, one of the techniques. It got more advanced where you might see 5,000-10,000 mobile phones chained up together, and they're automated to do that kind of thing through bot networks and whatnot. What's changed is that you can actually do that on a laptop now with, 50,000 agents. And so in the last year, the cost of a narrative attack has actually gone down by about 500x, opening it up to, a much wider group of people and actors that can run these narrative attacks at lower cost, lower precision, and lower expertise. So the first part is massive proliferation of narrative attacks, period. And anybody can kind of go and do that with some knowledge of what kind of harm they want to do. Right. I think where we see this going is if you don't have something like a narrative intelligence mitigation component that is agentic in nature, you can't actually fight the machine speed with which those narrative attacks are now operating against. And so we have our own kind of agentic detection and offensive platform that does detection, simulation and prediction of which way the narrative attack might go, and then automated playbooks that you can then run. And today we stop just short of actually having agentic response, but I believe that's actually the only way you can go, is that you need a blue team or a trusted party like a Blackbird, like our team, to be able to create that kind of attack in a safe environment so people can understand what they might actually be facing.
So why do you stop just short of agentic response today? And what would you need to have to feel confident and comfortable offering that?
We're building guardrails on how to deploy that safely. So we're comfortable with it internally in a lab environment or with very specific defense-oriented customers. But I think that's got to be the offering on the go forward, is you need an offensive AI, much like is becoming, if we walk the halls of RSA today, a lot of it is offensive AI in a sandbox, right? Blue team sandbox. And I think the same thing needs to occur for narrative attacks. And there needs to be trusted parties who are the ones actually running those kinds of conditions so that our customers or governments can understand how a real narrative attack would actually happen and how they could prevent it and of course respond to it.
So I guess I'm curious kind of the ability to separate signal from noise or to detect active manipulation. I know you gave the example of data centers earlier. Obviously, there's a whole lot of individuals who don't like data centers now and individuals who'd be willing to share misinformation to advance their arguments. So how are you able to determine whether something is a narrative attack, is nation state backed, is a deliberate, is manipulative versus just an individual who is poorly informed?
I think, one is that we've been building this system to do exactly that for the past 7 years, right? So, our very first customer, how we got our start was with Department of Defense through the algorithmic warfare teams that are trying to assess when are there state actors or threat actors trying to manipulate information to create some sort of outcome. So, I would say the best way to think about our lenses, rather than again, mentions and sentiment and trends, we look at things like narrative and story themes across multiple platforms, including like dark web and channels that most platforms don't look at. And most cyber teams really aren't actively looking at. They're looking at their own endpoints and network infrastructure, but they're not really looking at like the public perception around, the particular incident. But so narratives, networks, and actor groups. Those are the three categories that we have spent years building. Network was a big piece of it. It was originally our claim to fame. Most people look at the content. We look at the graph. So the relationships and the propagation and spread of how those narratives actually move through the environment, the velocity and the change in velocity that occurs when different actors then start amplifying those narratives. It also looks totally different if we see bot network activity and bot activity, which looks completely different when you look at it in a graph than human interactions. Very different signatures. So suppose there's a narrative around data center and say, health related. Data centers cause X, Y, and Z health issues, but 85% of it, we're able to see 85% of it are bot traffic. And of that, say 60% of that bot traffic are known Russian affiliated actors that are also doing other kinds of campaigns in like 7 other areas over the past 3 years. We would have that within our essentially our context graph, like a substrate we use to always match against what's happening now versus what we've seen over the past 7 years. When you have that level of observability, suddenly it's not, oh my God, there's 50,000 people upset about healthcare and data centers. There's a narrative with 80% bots, 60% Russian state actors, and that's kind of black and white. And so that is the use case for the product. Now it's just about applying it to the most like critical use cases in different industries to help them understand like, how do we actually face this threat and respond to it now that we can actually see what's really happening. Right.
So finally here, let's focus on that response piece. Yeah. I mean, I know that, when it comes to things like setting thresholds or decision owners or initial actions, what can be done in advance of a narrative attack, and how can that be helpful were such a strike to occur?
So there's a lot of different ways depending on the industry. So there's like, you have your strategic comms industry, you have your defense, and then you have your cyber and threat intel. But the part that holds up across that is early warning, of course. So, you kind of have to look at like just the seed of a narrative. And then we have a risk matrix or risk formula, depending on what kind of a company you are. Some people are attacked a lot, some people not as much. So their thresholds for risk are different. Being able to surface which narratives are going to do potentially the most harm. And then I mentioned before simulations. So we might look at those narratives. We would actually look at every single persona in that conversation. We would drive synthetic personas around that and run simulations on what might happen in the next 24 hours. Here's the 3 narratives that might cause most harm to you. If there's an automated recommended playbook that you can run against it. So you're kind of locked and loaded and ready if one of those things occur. Of course, if something else happens, you can also be aware of it and see which way the narratives are going, be able to counter and respond to it in the right way, right? So I think one of the things is just having all of that data and having what is essentially now an agentic harness that enables us to drive smart playbooks that's really the approach. I think it's probably the only approach that enables you to be like ahead of the game. It's one of these things that you can't just boil the ocean with frontier models either. A, it'd be super expensive, and B, I think one of the things I think about a lot is that the frontier models and LLMs, all that they have absorbed about social media, they think it's people talking. The models think these are all people talking, but they are not. They don't know which ones are bots, which ones are state actors. And so it's a bit of like confusion in, confusion out. So you need that substrate layer that we've spent like close to 7 years building to be that harness to enable those agents to do the right thing. So agents can be very intelligent, but they can have poor judgment. And so what we provide is that judgment layer to be able to decision and counter. That's actually like our newest bleeding edge things that we're working on and launching it like, month by month, like new pieces to early adopters.
It's a fascinating space to operate in. Wasim, thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. We've been speaking with Wasim Khaled, CEO at Blackbird.AI. For ISMG, this is Michael Novinson.